Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Wednesday, the 23rd of April 2025. We're delighted to welcome Emma Reynolds, the Economic Secretary to His Majesty's Treasury, accompanied by Laura Webster, who's the Director of Personal Tax, Welfare and Pensions at the Treasury. Certainly a productive sounding role, three jobs in one there, Ms Webster, to talk about the lifetime ISA, also known as the LISA, or as we would refer to it, where we would try to spell it out as where it's appropriate. We've been looking at this with various other individuals, but obviously it's very important to hear what the government's position is on the lifetime ISA, which was established to enable people to purchase their first time property with a bonus from the government on top of their the money that they put into it, and if they don't purchase a first time property, then it kicks in at 60 as a retirement product. So it's an interesting hybrid product, and that's one of the reasons that we were keen to look at it. And so to kick off, I'm going to ask Rachel Blake MP to come in. Ms Blake.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much. Welcome to the committee. We've been spending quite a bit of time thinking about ISAs, the cash ISA, the LISA, and also its role with supporting people into home ownership. So we wanted to start off by talking about why you might want to change the cash ISA. What is there? What incentives might there be? What reasons might there be to change the cash ISA at the moment?
Okay. So I should say that as we announced in the spring statement, we are looking at reform of ISAs in the round.
Yeah.
About how to drive better return for savers, but also support the government's mission to drive greater economic growth, obviously lifting people's living standards. I am not going to be making any announcements before the committee. Your inquiry into the LISA is, and any other recommendations with regard to the broader ISA landscape will be very, very, very timely, because we are still considering our options.
Thank you. Ms Blake?
Thank you. So in terms of the popularity of the cash ISA, is there scope within the cash ISA enough to support home ownership?
Well, we will be looking at the advantages and perhaps downsides of all the different ISAs in the round, alongside our primary objective as a government to improve people's living standards through better economic growth, and, as we said in the spring statement, looking at striking a better balance between cash and equities, because we know that there are many people putting cash aside who could consider, and actually might consider, investing in stocks and shares. There's over 12 million people, I think this is according to the FCA, I think Laura will correct me if I'm wrong, who have more than £10,000 in cash savings, and of those 12 million people, about 5 million who are open to the idea of investing but perhaps lack the confidence to do that. As you know, and we think we might have talked about this last time, I can't remember, we're also looking at the advice guidance boundary, which I know the previous government were looking at too, and as John will know, that's something that's been discussed and talked about, and there's been a couple of different attempts at changing it, but certainly I am very passionate that it shouldn't just be the 8% of people who can afford financial advice who are basically getting more out of their money in the longer term. That should not be the preserve of 8% of the population, and that those opportunities should be available to others too. So we're looking at targeted support, which would be essentially providers of financial services firms being able to suggest to clients who have a similar set of characteristics certain things they could do with their money without putting any pressure on them, but that might make sense, would make sense in their financial circumstances. And this obviously applies to pensions as well, and particularly the sort of decumulation side of pensions. I won't go into that in detail, but the FCA are looking at it across the board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll come back later.
Okay.
Yeah. I totally respect and obviously recognise the sensitivity around making any announcements today, but I mean it's widely thought that there could be a move away from exclusive cash ISAs into more equity-based products, and I personally welcome that. But this whole issue, can I just pick up on that you've mentioned, Minister, about the sort of capacity of the mass market, if you like, and their willingness to go down the equities route. If you reduce, let's say, the cash ISA limit to 4,000 or 5,000 and you've got that massive extra capacity, how do you avoid a situation where actually, there'll be masses of people who will feel very uncomfortable, and how can you avoid from the outset the risk that you set up scandals that have exist where people sort of jump on the opportunity to advise people to shift money out of cash into something that's not suitable. You mentioned the boundary review. I know it's a really tough matter, but could you just say a little bit more about how you anticipate getting the benefit of which it undoubtedly is massive, to increase the amount of money that's in aggregate put into equities, hopefully UK equities, whilst avoiding that consumer problem? How do you head it off at the start?
Okay. Well, obviously, all of these choices, as you'll know, Mr. Glenn, are finely balanced, given your significant stretch in my job. The longest serving, weren't you?
You can just about make it if you survive till August 29, I decided.
Here. Those decisions are definitely above my pay grade. So we are looking in the round at what to do on ISAs. We are very interested in boosting the culture of retail investment. Anything we do will be very carefully considered. And I just want to say to the committee, and I've said this on the floor of the House, I understand, because I have cash savings myself, that everybody, if they can afford to, would like to have some sort of cash savings as a financial buffer in case something goes wrong. I lost my seat in 2019 and had a cash buffer for it, right? Your boiler might break down, you might lose your job, or you might, your car might break down. So people will always have some cash savings, and no one is suggesting that should be otherwise. The FCA is doing the detailed policy work on this and has just concluded a policy sprint on targeted support, which is a really interesting way of testing the policy. So I can't give you much detail around that, but I think that it's really good that the FCA is looking at it in detail to get it right. As you say, we've got to strike the right balance here. Ideally, we'd have all the benefits and decrease the risk of the downsides. But we do have some, very good providers that are FCA regulated that have to comply with a whole set of rules, and so hopefully if consumers are given the confidence to invest for the longer term, and appropriate warnings about, you've got to be in it for the longer term. There's no point investing in a stocks and shares ISA if you need the cash in 6 to 12 months or whatever it is in a short time frame. You've really got to want to save that money for the longer term. Then we think that giving people that confidence would be good for their financial resilience and good for the economy.
I certainly recognise the complexity and the tough decisions you have to make. Can I just ask one question then about the interaction between the ISA potential reforms, with all the caveats that you've mentioned, and the lifetime ISA? Oh. Clearly, both have a different set of advantages, if you like, in terms of one being an envelope for 20,000 at the moment, for tax-free on a perpetual basis of accumulated sort of growth and etc. And the other one attracting an annual £1,000 bonus, essentially. We've looked at obviously different issues around the deadweight cost, and some of them we'll come on and look at some of that. But are you actively looking at the interaction between the profile of different cohorts at different levels of wealth of ISAs and how they use ISAs and lifetime ISAs? Because one of the emerging issues that we're looking at is the fact that there is potentially quite a lot of deadweight cost in the lifetime ISA. How can you ensure that the sort of quantum of fiscal advantages that you may have at your disposal are optimally deployed through these changes?
So HMRC, as I know that there's been some correspondence between the chair and HMRC. HMRC have commissioned 3 reports, and they brought forward the first report and published it yesterday in order to assist the committee in your inquiry, which, as I say from the top again, is very, very timely, the inquiry that you're doing. And the second study, which they haven't published yet, is looking at a number of very significant factors around the demographic of the users of LISAs, the original reason that the subscriber opened LISA, the savings and the employment status, the sort of savings status. We're very much looking forward to this research. It's going to do a lot of different things, so there's a lot of pressure on the people conducting it. But in all seriousness, this again will be very timely, because I think it's right, as you say, that if we are going to use taxpayers' money, that it is used in the right way.
Forgive me, just because if it's a lifetime ISA, conceivably then it could start much earlier. It could start before the age of 18.
I see what you mean. Well, we do have the JISA to cover that segment of the market, so I don't know.
So just be clear, junior ISA. For anyone.
Sorry, junior ISA. Mm-hmm. Apologies.
So you don't see it as fusing with that or moving back?
You're the first to mention it. I would have to have a think about that, but I'm not sure that you would necessarily want to create an overlapping product with the youth ISA.
It's just whether you simplify and have one that has enduring advantage rather than have.
We'll take that back.
We can point you to evidence we've had about this, which has been quite interesting.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, but the second study will be very interesting in terms of that. The first one is qualitative, as you've seen, and the second is quantitative, and surveys users of the LISA, and the third one is surveying non-users of the LISA. So I think this will give us a lot more data, and it will be rich in terms of what we can get from it in a way that we haven't had yet, because as you'll know very very acutely, that the LISA, although it was introduced not in your tenure, wasn't designed by you, Mr. Glenn, it wasn't that long before you took up office as EST. So 2017 is still a relatively new product compared to the other LISAs, which are 25 years old.
Part of the reason we're looking at it, I thought it was a good time. Thank you very much, Mr. Glenn. Dame Harriet Baldwin, MP.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. And I think I was the Economic Secretary when it came in. So
reunion.
Several of us.
We could have a meeting afterwards.
But what I think is very interesting, and I welcome, is that you've mentioned the need to look at the advice guidance boundary and the targeted support changes early on in this conversation, because what we want to try and do with these initial questions is sort of give you an opportunity to talk strategically about where you see the LISA fitting into the landscape. You will have been aware from when you were Pensions Minister last year at the time of the October budget how hares started to run and people took actual decisions with their savings as a result of those hares running. So that's why I'm just keen to give you that chance to talk about how you see the LISA fitting in strategically to this whole landscape. You've mentioned that you do think cash savings is important and something that therefore should be incentivised through the tax system. I think I heard you say that. Specifically with home ownership, though, is home ownership as part of your overall goal of improving people's living standards through improving economic growth? Do you see home ownership as being a key part of that?
Yes.
First-time buyers being an important group to support. You do that is a strategic objective. Yeah. And clearly you're also looking at pension savings in the round and auto-enrolment, and whether there need to be any edits to that as we go forward, and presumably pension saving continues to be at the core of helping people's living standards, and you would accept this. So
the Minister's nodding for the record. Just
yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
I mean, I'm no longer the Pensions Minister. Take a very, very close interest in it,
Yeah.
given only just given up being Pensions Minister not that many months ago.
Yeah.
But we, at the moment, are focused very much on the first stage of the review, not the second, but obviously there's a link between the two.
And then you mentioned stocks and shares, and presumably you do see that as a way for UK taxpayers to share in the growth of the economy and invest for the long term, and therefore something that it makes sense to encourage through the tax system. So just having sort of got you to nod to all of those strategic things.
Just to be clear, about hares running, I mean, we just don't want to add to the speculation. There's a lot of things that are written in newspapers, and this is no offence to the journalists, but there's a lot of speculation about what the government might and might not do. Obviously, as a Treasury Minister and Treasury official, it's very difficult. We can't comment on all the speculation, but we don't want to fuel it either. So.
The stocks and shares, when you talk about stocks and shares, are you specifically focusing on investing in the UK?
Well, it would be investing in stocks and shares. We are, as part of the pensions review phase 1, we are looking at what more can be done to drive investment into our own stock market, but that wouldn't be exclusive because, as you'll know, Dame Harriet, to have a balanced portfolio, you really do want to be investing in lots of different places.
So, because you did cancel the British ISA, didn't you, as one of the first acts of the new government?
Yes, but that would have helped those who were already able to put 20 grand plus into an ISA. I mean, I wasn't the Economic Secretary at the time, but there were reasons for that beyond, the additional investment that might have brought for stocks and shares.
It does imply that we shouldn't expect the new landscape to be more generous to the taxpayer than it currently is.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Right.
But all taxes are kept under review.
Okay. So one other thing in terms of incentivising first-time buyers, you have made a sharp change in terms of the stamp duty that a first-time buyer pays, and I wondered if you think that cuts across some of the encouragement to save for your first home.
Well, there's lots of different support available for first-time buyers, and also the biggest impact, arguably, for first-time buyers will be increasing the supply of homes. So our government is committed to building 1.5 million homes over the course of this Parliament. We have taken forward the most ambitious planning reforms that have been seen for generations, and in the spring forecast we were very pleased to see that the OBR scored the planning changes, and this is just the MPPF planning changes from December, not the Planning and Infrastructure Bill changes that are going through Parliament at the moment, scored it and gave us the biggest ever enhancement in GDP from those changes for any non-fiscal change that we've seen. So we're very committed to increasing the supply of homes. We're committed to the mortgage guarantee scheme. We are in very active conversations with the FCA, because the FCA, in response to our recent letter to encourage them to really hone in on growth and competitiveness, came back to us and said that they would look at the mortgage rules. I have then gone back to Nikhil Ratty at the FCA to ask them to do that in short order and to be ambitious. So we're working very closely with the FCA on that, and there is a particular emphasis on first-time buyers there. And then obviously there are other saving products like the LISA, but not exclusively, which help people to save for a deposit. Sorry, I'm very keen that Laura wants to come in.
We might want to bring in Ms. Webster
I
in
just
when
have
it
one
comes to
last quick question, if I may. Given your reluctance to start any hares running in terms of speculation, I presume that you would want to make these announcements of changes sooner rather than later. So can you tell us when we are going to hear about these changes?
Let me just say, we are committed as a government to one fiscal event a year, and that is, we think, better for consumers and business, because it means that there aren't continual changes twice or three times a year. So we are committed to one budget a year. The spring statement wasn't a budget, despite what some might have tried to describe it as. The next budget will be in the autumn.
And that's when we'll hear these changes.
Well, that's the earliest we'll hear these changes.
Well, I am not going to comment about these changes because we are still in the policy consideration phase. But as I said, we are committed to one fiscal event. That therefore
it's not this autumn; it's next autumn.
That therefore gives people time to plan. If we were to announce any changes, whatever they might be, in the autumn budget, they would come in, usually, obviously there are some that come in straight away, but some of these other changes usually come in for the financial year.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. Thank you, Dame Harriet. John Grady.
Thank you, Dame Meg. One of the things you're emphasising, Minister, is the fact that long-term saving in equities is better for people. It will give them more comfortable retirements and later lives. And that's backed up by evidence by people like Dimson, Marsh and Staunton. But if I was a new retail investor, I would turn on the news and I'd see the US markets are moving around rapidly as to whether or not the chairman of the Fed is in a job or not this week. The global economy is very unstable at the minute. This is a very difficult environment in which to achieve a retail revolution of the sort we're seeking to achieve, isn't it?
Well, I mean, we've got to talk about people investing for the long term, and you'll have seen some of the research by platforms like AJ Bell and others that suggest that if people were invested in an ISA for 25 years, since 1999, they'd have invested only £1,000 a year in that time, they'd have made a lot more of their money in stocks and shares had they been in cash. I was talking about this in Westminster Hall yesterday, so if you want the stats, they're not in my head, but they are in the Hansard from Westminster Hall. But it was a very striking difference between the two.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grade. So now moving on to LISAs more specifically. Bobby Dean MP.
Yeah, I guess I cut to the chase with the most straightforward question. We've heard a lot of evidence about LISAs, and there's probably three options on the table to our mind. We could keep it as it is, we could change it, or we could abolish it. Are those the three options that are on the table for you, or any of them ruled out?
Well, we are looking at ISA reform in the round, and we are very keen to hear your recommendations, but we're also very keen to see what the second HMRC study tells us, because it's really going to give us a very detailed breakdown.
So it could be abolished?
Well, as I say, we're looking.
Is it all on the table? I think
is it all on the table basically?
Coming back to Dame Harriet's point, I don't want to set hairs. Right, we've got 1 million people invested in this product, and I think it's £5.5 billion. So, as I said, we're looking at ISA reform in the round, and we're very interested to hear what your recommendations are with regard to this product. It's quite an unusual product, as you've already pointed out, because it has a dual purpose. I think the original intention was that it might have more than a dual purpose, by the way, from what I understand.
Yes, indeed.
But you had obviously Michael Johnson before you, who was very into the detail of the design of the policy. Sorry?
He wrote it.
Yeah, he wrote it. But I hear he was also quite disappointed with the outcome. But
He was disappointed with George Osborne's implementation of it, because the pensions industry got to him.
Right, okay.
There's an opinion.
It's very interesting to hear the evolution of these things, because obviously, we weren't involved in the design of it. So we will look at it. We will look at it in the round.
But to flip the question on its head then, would you be happy to keep it as it is, or do you think it will need some changes to pay?
We haven't. We are looking at it in the round alongside other ISAs, alongside the reform that we've suggested in the spring statement that we are looking at. How do we drive better return for savers? How do we support the government's ambition to drive greater economic growth?
Okay. Can I go into one of the specifics then about the hybrid element, the dual purpose of the product?
Sure.
In a previous committee, I shared the fact that I used the LISA to help me purchase my first home.
Well done.
And then,
how is it?
Then had 70. Yeah, the home's great. But then I left. I left the 70p that was the balancing figure in the account and haven't touched it since. I am sad to report that I had it in a stocks and shares version. That's down to 63p now, but that's it's a slightly separate issue. The core point being,
You've got to be in it for the long term.
Yeah, exactly. The core point being, I've kind of abandoned it since, and I think many users have as well, from what we heard in the inquiry. So, would the dual purpose be something you'd be at least looking to improve or address that element?
Well, again, I'm sorry, I'm really trying not to be evasive, but the HMRC study number 2 is going to be really key to this particular question, and it is a question that we are considering very carefully. You could argue that one of the benefits of this dual purpose is that it's very flexible. You may have a situation where somebody is using it to purchase a home, that doesn't work out. They could actually use it for a pension later in life. So, there are pros and cons of having a dual purpose ISA in this regard. It is something we're looking at. It is something that HMRC has commissioned as part of the second study to look at how the transition works, whether it works for people, whether people use it, whether people are subscribing for what people are subscribing for. Mostly, I think people are subscribing for a specific purpose, but some people might be open-minded about how they're going to use it. So they've actually gone out to the field and asked those questions. So we will get a better breakdown of the uses of the LISA and this question about transition.
Yeah, I guess we just heard evidence saying that it's really holding the product back, you'll be aware that there aren't so many people out there offering the lifetime ISA, and one of the reasons why is because people feel that actually having this additional element means that it's quite difficult to provide advice, because you've got kind of two different objectives. One's a sort of short to medium term objective of getting a home, one's a very long term objective of retirement. Is that a concern to you?
Well, we'd be very interested in your views as a committee on that, and given
so
what
we're
you've
also
heard.
interested in your views. Sorry,
Yeah, no, I understand
it's going to
that.
be quite a long hour if every question we ask about LISA is going to be dependent on the report. So could you give us a better indication?
It could be a long hour. Look, I mean, the reason that your report and your inquiry is timely is precisely because we're in the policy formation stage. And if that's a disappointment to you, that it shouldn't be, because actually that's the point of select committees, is to influence government policy. So yes, we will look at that alongside other parts of the characteristics of the LISA.
Thank you. John Grady.
Do you want to come in?
I was
Webster, sorry.
Thanks. I was just going to say that the research the Minister was referring to, I mean, partly is that research was commissioned and the first part was carried out in 2023. Partly, as the committee knows, because of the questions that you've asked HMRC, there is quite a lack of granular data on users and usage of the product. So the research really will be very powerful in helping give us much better information. It will ask people, the second stage the Minister was referring to asks, I think, over 1,500 people in a kind of representative sample why they set up the product. So we'll be able to better understand the demographics between those who set it up for the primary purpose of saving for a home or for longer term savings. I think the other thing, going back to the relative immaturity of the product, relatively few people have actually kind of left phase one and moved into phase two. So that is still quite early days.
And they couldn't until 2037.
2037.
Because they have to be 60 when,
Exactly.
I don't know if you're going to put a few more pence in.
Soon,
No, you don't look like you're turning 60 soon. But I don't know if you have a few more pennies in there before you're 60. I don't know. But, that we can't, it's very difficult for us to evaluate, even the phase two of the study,
we
to
heard
evaluate
evidence on that as well.
Sorry, Laura, to cut
that's
across.
fine.
Thank you. John Grady, MP.
I hope we're not going to have to disclose all our birthdays in this committee, but will that, this is a question maybe from Ms Webster, will that HMRC study cover the following points? First of all, whether people are using the LISA appropriately from a tax point of view, bearing in mind that you get your 20% bonus, but in Scotland, if you're earning over £27,492 a year, you pay tax at 21% because we pay more tax in Scotland. Will it look at that point specifically?
Yeah, so it will look at your wider savings profile, but also your demographics and your household demographics. So it will be able to say what proportion of savers are basic rate or high rate taxpayers.
And will it be able to then make the leap to whether actually people are using it in the most tax effective way?
I'm not sure it will provide for each individual a kind of cast iron, this is the right decision for you from a tax efficient perspective. I think also, as you'll know, it will depend on how you intend to use that money in later life as well, because if really what you want is to withdraw a larger chunk, then you'll need to think about the profile of which you're withdrawing and your marginal rate that you will be paying in retirement. So it's almost too difficult to give a very precise answer on that question, but it will say whether people are, which tax bracket they are in now, and that will give an indication of whether it's kind of sensible use of tax efficient savings. It will also look at whether they're employed or self-employed, whether they are in a workplace pension separately. For example, it would be concerning, I think, if the study found significant numbers of employees who were not choosing to take part in their workplace pension and had opted out of automatic enrolment, but were in the lifetime ISA for that motivation. I think that would be a worrying finding. I remember when the product was launched, there was some concern by the pensions industry, about the potential for it to undermine automatic enrolment. My experience is that concern has not materialised, and it's not something I hear from the industry anymore, and it is seen to be a bit more of a complement than a substitute for workplace pensions.
And the other point, will the HMRC study address specifically whether people are making appropriate investment choices? Because as the Minister has explained correctly, the long-term best way to invest is in equities and not in cash. Will it cover that point specifically?
Again, not to a kind of personalised, would a financial advisor recommend you take this course of action, but it will give higher level findings on what proportion of people are in stocks and shares versus cash for different profiles.
And then a quick question for the Minister. We've heard evidence that the withdrawal charge is causing hardship. We've also heard evidence that the property price cap should potentially be increased. If the withdrawal charge was changed or the property price cap was increased, that would obviously have a public finance implication.
Indeed.
That could be quite material. Mm-hmm. So is the government assessing robustly whether or not those steps are appropriate and whether there are better ways of spending the money?
Well, we've heard concerns expressed in your committee, and we have correspondence about some of the rules around withdrawal. You will understand that you're absolutely right. You got to the point I was going to make about this, which is obviously any changes that could be made to perhaps improve that situation would cost money, and you'd have to get the money from somewhere else. But also, there was mixed views in the research study 1 of HMRC from users, and this is obviously qualitative, not quantitative, about the withdrawal charge. Some described it as unfair, and some thought it was actually a good deterrent to them, making sure that they didn't take their money out. So, there's mixed views amongst users as to whether the withdrawal charge is a good thing or not. Obviously, the LISA, we didn't design it, by the way, but I didn't design it, but it is a voluntary savings product, and people go into it with their eyes wide open, and the providers should make sure that they understand the terms and conditions, and having some rules around a penalty if you withdraw is in line with, for example, rules around if you were to make an unauthorised withdrawal of your pension. And in fact, the penalty for withdrawing your pension early is much heftier than when the 25% in this case. So, we can't have a risk-free option of you invest for the long term, but if you take it out, there isn't a charge. We wouldn't have that situation. So there has to be some sort of penalty or withdrawal charge in a product like this.
Thank you, Dame Meg.
Rachel Blake MP.
Thank you, Chair. You talked yourself about how supply of homes can really help with home ownership. And I wanted to come in now to talk about value for money for the overall product against its stated objective of supporting home ownership. We had some pretty compassionate evidence from some of the providers about the change and the transformation that the product can have for people who are going into home ownership. And yet we know that the average withdrawal to buy a home has been £15,000, but the average first-time buyer deposit is around £55,000. So what the committee is really trying to get to the heart of is what actual difference is the lifetime ISA making to home ownership, and whether or not that 500 million annual, which is going up to 600 million annual, could be invested in another product or another intervention to support home ownership. So we've looked into what evidence there might be about alternative products, and I'd be keen to know what assessment you've made on value for money of this particular product to support that stated objective around home ownership.
Minister.
Okay, thank you. So just a few stats to sort of build on what you've said. So we know that about 6% of those eligible to take out a LISA have taken one out. So if you're between the ages of 18 and less than 40, I'm not in that category, Mr. Dean, but I do admit. However, 9% of first-time buyers since its introduction in 2017 have used it. Obviously, in the early years, there weren't many people using it because, as Mr. Dean will know, you've got to build up some, for it to be worthwhile. You probably want to be in there for a couple of, at least 2 or 3 or more years to get the bonus. As to what impact it's having on home ownership overall, I think that's difficult to say right now. I think, again, I'm sorry to keep referring to the second study, but it is there's lots of expectations on HMRC's provider here of the study, but that will give us some more depth on those issues. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, it explicitly asks users whether they so of the group who have withdrawn to buy their first home, it asks them whether the LISA was kind of critical, helpful, or a bit of a nice to have. So I think that finding will be particularly interesting to ministers and the committee when that comes through.
So that's a direct question, a kind of multiple choice question. Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. So just probing on this in terms of supply. Obviously, you could invest this money in shared ownership, and that would have that would have an impact as well. Would have a different impact. And I've spent some time. I think the committee clerks have spent some time trying to find any comparative evidence against different products, because shared ownership products is new supply and it's incentivising new supply. Yeah. So, what is there any evidence that you're aware of that could show the value that this product would have against investing in shared ownership?
I personally haven't looked at those comparisons, and we're not into the detail of that.
Okay, and just back to the research, the second piece of research, we haven't had any evidence so far that the money that's going into the LISAs is from individuals and not from family members. So we don't know at this point what, from the evidence that we've had so far or from HMRC, whether this is individuals able to save or gathering from friends and family. Is that going to be probed within the research?
Yes, that is covered in the research, because as you'll know, only the individual can deposit money, but the research is asking where the funds come from in the first place. So it will enable you to see whether it's from parents or inheritance or you're saving out of earnings, for example.
Thank you very much. Respect Dr. Jubensander.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. West, I want to pick up on what you just said around, well, I suppose also building on what Mr. Glenn has said around the deadweight loss of this product, and is it worth it, and is it helping people? If I'm answering correctly, the research will show whether or not people needed this to buy a home, whether actually it was just additional and who's contributing. Yeah. So do you think it's going to shed light on whether it's basically just subsidising middle class first time buyers who the bank mum and dad is already helping in any case?
It should help to answer that question. I mean, it is a self-reported, that question on did you need this product in order to complete the transaction will be the individual's view on it, but it's the best we will have on that question.
But it will also look at the tax bracket that the individual is in. It won't obviously give you the income of their parents, but it will give you
their income and their household income.
And on that, maybe to follow up on that, in terms of policy development where it's sat, I'd appreciate you guys came into office when it was already in place. Do you have any discussion at that time about who this was supposed to help? Because in one sense, it seems like it's intended to help those on lower incomes get up the housing ladder, but actually it looks like it could be additional, and it is about £500 million. It's a lot of money to be spending. Have you seen that in any of the work you came into office, or the descriptions, or any of the policy analysis?
Ms. Webster has been slightly longer in the job, I think, than the minister in this case. Is there any light you can shine on that, Ms. Webster?
I mean, I think there is, again, something interesting on the dual purpose of the product, because I think the research will be interesting to show whether there's difference in the profile between people who are saying they've opened this product for a later life savings product, where I think originally there was quite a lot of interest in targeting that perhaps at the self-employed people, versus those who are looking to get on the property market. And I think the price cap is one means of which, the property price cap is one means of which we're trying to, or the product was designed to target support at those looking to buy. I mean, I would say lower end of the market. It's obviously still above the average property price for the first time buyer, but it is targeted in that way.
Yeah, I suppose in one sense with that, I mean, I take the point, but obviously given how expensive house prices are and how much is growing in relation to income, it's still not helping, I suppose, younger people without rich parents to get on the housing ladder. I suppose a question maybe for you, Ms. Webster, I appreciate it's a broader question. We have a zero-based spending review, we're justifying each line of spending. This is, in some senses, almost like a tax relief or a tax subsidy. Would it have been helpful to go through each line, like the LISA, for example, and say, is this a good use of public money?
Well, I think, as the Minister says, tax is always kept under review, and lifetime ISA is technically a tax wrapper, so it is seen in that lens rather than a kind of spending review question. So to the extent that we are constantly looking at tax and the money that goes through various different schemes, it is always under review. The research was commissioned a while ago, and it's now coming through, and will be, I think, very informative to help understand who is using the product and how it is helping people.
And maybe to you, Minister, finally, in either reforming or changing the ISA, you spoke a lot about how it has to sit inside the broad scheme of what happens to the other ISAs as well. Will you be looking specifically at how it can be reformed to help lower income savers, specifically lower income savers without wealthy family members, help them to save for the future?
Well, we've got Help to Save also. Don't forget, there are other savings products which are targeted at those on low incomes, and we maybe we can talk about this as well. We, in the autumn budget, announced some extension of Help to Save to all universal credit claimants. I think, to be fair to the people who designed this product, I think it's quite difficult to make the sort of restrictions you're talking about if you only want to. I mean, you could, for example, with the Help to Buy ISA, the limit certainly on the house price outside of London was much more restricted. It was 250 grand rather than 450 grand. I mean, we have lots of complaints about the 450 grand, so I'm sure that the Help to Buy ISA had lots of complaints about the £250,000 cap, house price cap. So there are ways you could do what you're suggesting, but there are trade-offs. And I suppose the question is, do you want to help first-time buyers overall, or do you only want to help a subset of first-time buyers? But those are the sort of policy choices that you need to look at on that. But there are other, just to reiterate, this isn't the only savings product. Do you want to say anything about Help to Save or any other?
No, I mean, there's obviously the consultation that was launched at budget as well. So the decision was to extend Help to Save in the first instance and widen it to all universal credit claimants. And then there was a consultation on possible reforms, which closed, I think, in January. So there'll be a response to that shortly soon.
Very helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Dr. Sander. John Glennon, please.
Yes, I think, Mr. Webster, you mentioned self-employed, and the original intent was that the 25% bonus will provide an alternative vehicle for pension savings for the self-employed. To what extent is this review looking at that cohort and the failure of the sort of pensions regime to really deal with and encourage, despite auto-enrolment, the savings profile of self-employed being at the level it should be?
You're talking about the pensions review?
Well, I'm talking about the interaction between the two, because the truth is this has a bearing on that for self-employed. I wonder if you have any observations about how you bring out the relevance of this product for self-employed in the context of their pensions provision.
So on the kind of broader pensions review, I know you'll be aware that last July the government launched pensions investment review and said the second phase of the pensions review would be forthcoming, and that is still forthcoming. So the specific terms of reference for that review will be to be determined. But that I think at the time it said would look at kind of pensions adequacy and retirement savings in the round. So I would expect that to be a good candidate to be part of that review. But
so it's reasonable to assume that this LISA is a suitable vehicle for a certain cohort of pensions.
But there are others, obviously, for self-employed. I think overall, certainly when I was pensions minister, I was very concerned about the low level of savings of self-employed. But I mean, the LISA is a vehicle that self-employed people could use, but there's also SIPs and there are other vehicles that self-employed people could use. But it's true to say, Mr. Glenn, that we had auto-enrolment, which was great cross-party support, and it's been a very quiet but fantastic revolution in terms of the additional 11 million people now saving for a pension who weren't saving for a pension, but they are employed because they are saving through their pension, through their pay slips, and that doesn't apply. That quiet revolution hasn't obviously applied to those who are self-employed, and that is a cause of concern to the government.
We'd love to talk more about pensions, but we've got to focus.
I'd be here all day, but and Laura used to work at the DWP, so there we go.
on that, but that's mainly our sister committee's business, of course, as well. But I just wanted to pick up, Minister, you talked about people going into the lifetime ISA with their eyes wide open, to quote you. But as Mr. Dean highlighted, it's this hybrid product makes it much more challenging to give advice. Do you really genuinely believe that people are going into this fully informed of the choices they're making at all times, that there's an economic literacy? Because you did mention, of course, not lots of the figures you had about the people wanting to 12 million with money in cash ISAs, with 5 million of them interested in investing in stocks and shares. They're not doing that. But you seem to be confident they've gone on with their eyes wide open into a lifetime ISA.
Well, according to the first HMRC study, people said that they found it straightforward to open the ISA. They found it straightforward to use, the LISA, the lifetime ISA. They found it straightforward to use the LISA to fund the purchase of their home. The
withdrawal penalty is a particular issue, isn't it? And Well, if they can't,
as I say, there were mixed views. I think there is some confusion about the withdrawal penalty, because it's a 25% bonus, but when you withdraw, you don't just lose the bonus, you lose 25% of the whole. I can see how that could be confusing to people, but it's not the government's responsibility to ensure that. It's the provider's responsibility to make that clear.
But then, as Mr. Dean highlighted, because it's hybrid, you've got advice as a pensions product. It's quite difficult to craft for this reason, and you've got an ISA end of it. So you've got the short-term saving and then the long-term saving. And that's quite challenging for people to be thinking about it from both ends. Plus, it's 6. Well, we go into the details of the technical differences between other retirement products. But do you think people really understand it as well as you were suggesting? I just wonder if you want to.
Well, the truth is, I don't know, because we've only got the qualitative research so far. But the providers do have a responsibility to explain to those who are subscribing to the LISA what the rules are, what the terms and conditions are, what would happen if they withdraw when they shouldn't be withdrawing. So those rules should be set out by the provider. And as I said before, one argument is that there are some positive things to be gained from having that flexibility.
While you weren't the architect of this, and nor was this government, but nevertheless, you're in the hot seat now as the minister. This is a policy. The product is still a government policy. Do you think you have any responsibility to make sure that people are really going in with their eyes wide open?
Well, I think the design of the policy should be as optimal as possible, and the implementation, and the FCA obviously has the responsibility for ensuring that the providers ultimately the providers have the responsibility to ensure that they are providing the right information to their consumers, and they have a broader obligation now under the Consumer Duty to secure, to ensure they have the best outcome. So I admit some of it is a little confusing, but the dual nature I don't think is as confusing as the withdrawal charge issue that you mentioned. But this is obviously something that we'll consider in the round.
Thank you. Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. We've touched on the withdrawal charge, and I have a few questions about that, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to summarise in one place what you see as the main benefits in terms of the kind of behaviour that the charge is intending to drive, and also some of the main harms of the withdrawal charge as it is designed right now.
Well, I say I didn't design the product, but if you have a savings product which whose intended purpose is dual in this case, but the intended purpose of this product is to help people to save to buy a home and help people to save for retirement. If a withdrawal is made that doesn't comply with that intended purpose, it is quite normal that there should be a penalty, as is the case in pensions and other savings products.
And is that an intention in order so that people will use the product for that intended purpose rather than...
Yes, and also because they're getting quite a healthy bonus from the government.
Yeah. Do you see any...
so there has to be some quid pro quo. I mean, that's the deal, isn't it? You get 25% on top of your investment. Yeah. We can't have a product that gives you 25% when there isn't any penalty for withdrawing from it if you're not complying with the intended purpose. Otherwise, you'd get so many people into the product who are not using it for its intended purpose.
Absolutely. And do you see any harms with the charge as it is designed right now?
Well, look, I've read some of the evidence to your committee, and I have correspondence about the charge. But we have to have some rules, and inevitably there will be some hard edges. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
Only that I think HMRC have provided some additional data already to the committee and committed to providing some more from kind of additional extracts of the data they already have. But I think that has shown in a bit more detail both the number of unauthorised withdrawals and the average amount withdrawn and the different bands of withdrawal charges, which I hope the committee has found helpful. The research will go into that in more detail with the quantitative study to ask what led to that charge. I think the distribution shows most of it is in the kind of £0 to £1,000 charge category, which I think suggests, I don't think we have proof of this, but that would suggest it's more the kind of in response to an event where you need to dip in when you're looking at the average value of the authorised withdrawals obviously being much higher, around £15,000, and there's very few in the kind of top end which suggest it's people having to take everything out to buy the house. So I think that isn't conclusive because it's just the current distribution, but we will obviously get better information over time, but hopefully the committee's found that additional data from HMRC helpful.
And how do you, Ms. Webster, given that, as you described, you'd suspect based on the quantities involved that many people are incurring the charge because they've suffered an unfortunate life event. They've had to rely on their savings, as the Minister mentioned, whether that's a boiler breaking or something else happening in their life. In that scenario, do you and does the Minister see that withdrawal charge as being the right instrument, or is that a kind of one of the harms of the policy, or do you see that in some other way?
You couldn't design a policy that had so many get-out clauses. You couldn't say, oh, you won't have a withdrawal charge if your car breaks down or your washing machine breaks down. You couldn't have that. You have to have some rules around withdrawing that is a withdrawal that isn't in line with the intended purpose. You can't have a savings product that gives you a risk-free withdrawal. That doesn't exist in this case, and it doesn't exist in many other cases, in the other savings products either.
Perhaps we can talk about the level of risk, because as you mentioned...
And I just say, it is a voluntary savings product. So people don't have to save into the LISA. They could be saving into a cash ISA and not have a penalty for withdrawing, but they obviously wouldn't get the bonus. And the bonus is the thing that attracts people into the LISA from the evidence that we've seen.
And it should be possible with the supplementary work coming to see the kind of wider savings profile. So if there was a significant group of people who had a lifetime ISA but had no other savings whatsoever, that might be somewhat concerning, because you might expect people to have some cash saved in a different way, because that would be their kind of rainy day savings buffer, and the lifetime ISA is for another purpose. So we will be able to see how many people have no other cash savings and are using a lifetime ISA, which might detect an issue, or point to an issue, sorry.
Perhaps we can turn to the question of the level of the penalty charge, and with the 25% charges, as you mentioned, Minister, right now, anyone withdrawing for whatever reason will lose not just the government bonus, but also part of the capital that they've invested in the first place, 6.25% of that. During the pandemic, there was a reduction to 20% for the charge. I was wondering how you see that kind of trial period of that reduction has gone, and whether you have any thoughts on the overall level of charge.
Well, I mean, the pandemic brought some very difficult financial circumstances for people, and obviously we weren't in government, but I can absolutely appreciate why the government of the time chose to reduce the penalty charge. But we go back to the beginning and something that Mr. Grady said, which is, if you do reform this product, it is going to cost the government money, and therefore you will have to find money elsewhere. So there could be a case for changing the withdrawal charge, but you'd have to find some money from elsewhere in order to do that.
Ms. Webster, based on you having seen the charge over its different evolutions, is there any analysis, or do you have any views on the benefits and the costs of the different levels of charge?
I mean, there was in the data there was a significant increase in the year that it was lower, but that hasn't fallen back down. So I think I might have expected to see more of a spike in the data, if I'm honest, and I think it's interesting that hasn't materialised. Both the level of increase, perhaps not as high as we might have expected, but also it has remained at a kind of reasonably high, though I think it's about 7% of holders made an unauthorised withdrawal in the last year for which data is available. So it's significant, but it is a minority.
One last question on this theme. We discussed earlier the question of whether it's the well-off families who are benefiting more, and we know that low-income families tend to be more risk-averse. One of the panels that we heard on the Lifetime ISA from consumer champions talked about the deterrence of the withdrawal charge to risk-averse groups. Ms. Olifunwa in particular mentioned that people said that they were fearful, or that they found the idea of losing capital terrifying. And granted, of taken into account all the reasons why, the positive reasons why there needs to be penalties to shape consumer behaviour. I was wondering what you make of that particular testimony around risk-averse consumers.
Well, I think I go back to something my colleague said, which is there are other saving products out there for a rainy day. So, this product wasn't designed for rainy day savings, because if you need to be able to get hold of some cash for a rainy day, you look at a cash ISA or something similar. So that's what I would say in this case.
Yeah. So another savings vehicle might be more appropriate for that group. Is that what you're saying?
Or and then if they could save a little bit more, they might want to put into the LISA. I'm not going to, as the minister, give people a financial advice.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that the intended purpose of this savings product is not the financial buffer that other cash savings could provide for people.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bobby Dean MP.
Yeah, just briefly on the interaction of the withdrawal penalty with the price cap, because the price cap hasn't moved, and some were commenting that you're aspiring to save for a home, you think that you're targeting a home that's within the price cap, you use the LISA product, but then house prices go up over the period that you're saving for, and then you're punished for saving that way. So at the time you made a decision, it was a sensible investment. Have you got any thoughts on that and how that?
What I will say is that I do think that the house price cap is relatively high. If you look at the difference between the LISA house price cap and the Help to Buy, it's a 200 grand uplift from the Help to Buy ISA. And overall, from February this year, the average first-time buyer house price was £240,000.
So personally, I agree with that. I do think the cap's quite high, but I guess you're talking about sort of fairness point and what the consequences for choosing particular products. Oh. There are some people that might have, in good faith, chosen a product that was suitable for them, invested accordingly, but then get hit with a withdrawal penalty because the price cap hasn't moved, but house prices have. So would you be open-minded towards a specific exemption on the withdrawal penalty for people in that situation?
Well, that would be very difficult to police, and I go back to the point that, sorry to sound like a Treasury Minister on repeat, if we were to reform that, it would cost us money. And is that money you'd want to spend in this case, or you'd have to take money from elsewhere? I think it is right that, it goes really to Dr. Sanders' point about if you want to target it at those on lower incomes or lower middle incomes. The more you ratchet up the house price, the more you're helping people on the higher income. So I would question whether you want to do that. In the terms and conditions, when you sign up to the LISA, the provider should state that that's the house price, and it wouldn't state that house price would increase with inflation. And actually having some continuity around that, it might not be popular with those subscribing, particularly if they're in expensive areas, but at least gives the the consumer, if you like, some certainty about the level overall.
Yeah, I think we're going to go into price cap a bit more, but just finally then, we heard very strongly in some of our hearings that the 25% should be changed to 20% permanently. I'm getting the sense that that's not something you would consider. Is that right? Are you ruling that out?
Well, we are considering everything in the round, but it would cost us money. So we'd have to find the money from elsewhere.
In summary, you're happy for that withdrawal charge to include that punitive element because not doing it would cost the government money?
Not doing that would cost the government money, and it is a strong incentive for people not withdrawing. So you'd have to look at, if you were going to reduce it to 20% or less, what impact that would have, and whether that's really the desired outcome.
People would obviously lose the bonus, which is one of the big reasons for taking it in the first place.
Indeed.
So that's something. No doubt, everything's on the table, I think is the latest phrase from government, isn't it? So it sounds like that would be good. But just coming back to the price cap, and I absolutely, and we've had discussion about who it's aimed at, but the 450,000 price cap is affecting some diligent savers in constituencies like mine, which is, you can't buy a property, very few properties at that level. The typical price for a new 2-bedroom property would be £750,000. So just to be clear, that there is no plan, from what you said, just to be clear on the record, no plans to look at the price cap in the future of this.
Well, we're looking at everything in the round, but if we were to put it up to that level, then you really would. If we were to do that, let's take it as a hypothetical, then it would cost the government more money because you'd have more people subscribing to that product because they would know that they would be able to buy a product of that value, which is, outside of Hackney, I'm sorry to say, is a very high house price. I know there are other parts of London, such as Ms Blake's constituency, where that isn't probably as high.
Just to be clear, Ms Blake represents cities of London and West Midlands.
Indeed.
Shoreditch, both in Zone 1 central London or in parts of it.
Indeed. I represent a constituency outside of London, in Wickham. Buckinghamshire's got quite high house prices, but nothing like you see in Hackney.
So on that point then, I mean, at the moment you get, you can't increase the house price cap for joint buyers. Is that something that might be considered? So you've got two people saving, they meet up, decide to buy, or maybe they're together anyway, but they buy together. At the moment, that applies. The price cap applies whether you're a couple or an individual.
You'd want to be quite careful about that. I mean, I don't know what was in the minds of the people who designed the policy in the first place, but I can see the logic of, if you're buying as a couple, you're not able to just double the price. Because again, that does make the product available to many, many more people buying much, much more expensive properties.
And I mean, so you also, I mean, in terms of the house prices, the Help to Buy ISA did have some regional element to it, but there isn't for the LISA. It's just that one national cap.
But it's much more generous.
Yeah. So
I mean, in terms of, sorry, when I say generous, it's much more generous in terms of the level of house price.
Yeah. So basically, just to be clear about what's on the table and what's not. At the moment, you're not. Just be clear. Would you be considering any regional variations? It can be hard.
It's not something that I have actively considered.
Okay. And then just going back again to this withdrawal charge, the key thing, as Mr. Dean was driving at, is when you hit that price cap. So in a constituency like Ms. Blake's and mine, and would be now people may have been saving in good faith, and the only option they have to use this is outside of the area that they're currently living in, so to move areas, or they pay.
Many of us move out. Some of us even moved outside of London to get a better, lower house price.
Or even indeed, and lots of our constituents are driven out for all sorts of reasons, owners and tenants. But if it was proven that was the reason, I mean, is there any prospect that you would look at reducing the withdrawal charge because they could not actually use it in the area in which they're living, or is it that?
I'm sympathetic to these people. It's difficult, some of these cases. Yeah. But if you have a what if, all the complexity that you build in is then very difficult to police. So I think it would be very difficult to see a scenario where you had a lot of what ifs, I'm afraid.
So in a way, to summarise it, it's not really designed for constituencies that are in central London where prices are above that cap. But
it was designed at a time when house prices were low, and that's the point that Mr. Dean is making. I don't know how much lower in your constituency at the time, to be frank.
Quite a lot. They've gone up very rapidly. To be
right.
fair,
Okay.
But I mean, we're not talking about my constituencies. It's just an example, really, of the challenges of regional pricing. So.
Yeah, and look, I do receive a fair amount of correspondence about the price cap. But as I said before, if we are to if we were to increase the price cap, then we would have to find money from elsewhere. And then the question would be, is that value for money for the taxpayer?
Indeed, I think as Dr. Sander teased out with Ms. Blake, there are issues about who it's directed at. So we appreciate, Minister, you have a lot of options and choices on the table. Can I just go back to this first HMRC report that was being talked about? Just to be clear, Ms. Webster, that's the one that had 50 telephone interviews.
Yes.
Yes. So we'd be careful perhaps not to lean too heavily on that. Were they weighted interviews?
No. It was a qualitative
exactly.
survey.
So, but it's only 50 people had a discussion. So we can't rely too heavily on that.
No, but it's indicative.
But the second report is more thorough.
Definitely, yes. There's over 1,500, I think 1,600 surveys with LISA holders, and then a similar weighted sample representative with non-holders.
Thank you very much indeed. Lola McAvoy, MP.
Thank you, Dame Meg, and welcome Ms Webster from sunny Darlington, where you are my constituent and working at the Darlington Economic Campus. It's great to see you here. Quick question. We've heard a lot about the intended purpose. What is the intended purpose of the LISA as a retirement savings product?
So, I mean, I would say it's there to give people choice about how they wish to save for retirement. So I can see the original design focusing on self-employed, where there's perhaps more of a gap in the market. But originally, going back to the Turner Commission, there was a kind of division there for kind of three-tier, where the state pension provides the foundation. The government policy encourages people nudging into automatic enrolment, and then there's a layer of voluntary savings on top of that. And I think in reality, the voluntary savings haven't quite materialised. So LISA is one product in a suite of pension savings and wider retirement savings products that's available. In terms of who it's for, it does depend on individual circumstances, both your kind of expected tax bracket whilst you're accumulating, and then where you expect to be when you're retiring, and how you wish to use your retirement savings, as I was saying earlier, given that it's under a LISA, it's the TEE, so tax exempt model. So if you want more freedom on what to do at the end without paying tax, then LISA might be your preference, even if there might be a possible less tax efficiency, to Mr. Grady's point. But there are obviously SIPs and other options, non-pension savings options available as well.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of your data and your analysis of people who are incurring the charge, are the majority of people, so it's £75 million, I think, in 2022-23, that was made in incurring charges from people who'd saved and then had to withdraw early. Are they people who have been saving for their first home and had to withdraw before buying it, or are they people using it as this retirement savings product and had to withdraw that? Do you know where that, roughly what the distribution is?
We don't know yet.
Okay, so there's no analysis of that until this HMRC?
We will have better data on that. I think I would just point, though, to the distribution that HMRC have already provided, which to me, as I said, it suggests, it doesn't prove, but it suggests, because the bulk of those withdrawal charges are quite small, that you're not withdrawing the money to buy a property above the price cap, because I would expect a higher amount to be withdrawn.
Okay, and then in terms of the data as of a savings product, I think our analysis shows, or we heard evidence that in 2019-20, 8% of people who'd used the product to save for their first home continued to use it for a savings product, and that's fallen to only 1% of people this year in 24-25. So what's your analysis of whether, as a savings product, it's fit for purpose, and do you think the LISA is on life support?
Honestly, I think it's too early to tell, and I think some of the early evidence you've heard suggested that actually there is some potential benefit of getting people in the habit of saving and kind of awareness of the product. Maybe it's okay if they withdraw, and then the point at which you buy your first home is not a point where you feel awash with lots of excess cash that you can continue saving, but it's there for you to come back to later. And I just think the product hasn't had enough time yet for us to give a well-rounded answer on that point. It's certainly true that so far, from the evidence I've seen, and thank you to the committee for publishing that yesterday afternoon, that you've received from others, it does look like a low percentage are continuing to save, but a much higher percentage are keeping the accounts open. Now, that could be inertia as much as an active choice, but I think it's interesting that we aren't seeing the majority of people withdraw to buy their home and then shut their account. So I think we just need to watch it.
Okay, and Minister, so obviously 2019-20, 8% of people who had used the product for their first home put in for a retirement product, falling 7% in 2021, 6% in 22, 4% in 24, and 1% in the last year. Do you think that's a sign of the times, or do you think it's a fall in the product's effectiveness?
Well, I'm not into that. I'm going to ask my colleagues.
So just to be clear, because I know just shouting numbers at you isn't helpful. It's just a steady decline from 2020 in terms of people reusing it as it was intended to continue saving. It's quite stark, from 8% to 1%. Obviously, we've seen cost of living crisis, lots of other changes. Do you think there's a likeliness that it could take an uptake and it is fit for purpose and it's just a sign of the times, or do you think this is a steady decline?
I mean, look, we don't know is the truth. It could be that there are people who have put money in, saved for a house, a bit like Mr. Dean, bought the house, kept it open, not put much more money in. There's quite probably, I don't know, anecdotally, there may be quite a few people in that position. They've kept it open through inertia. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Mr. Dean, that might be the case, but might actually start...
Maybe it was inertia.
Might start to contribute in the future. People move out of employment to self-employment. I can see there's if you are self-employed, this might be quite an interesting product. There are others, as I've said, to save for a pension, but this is one. And it means, as Ms. Webster said, that it's tax. You get your income taxed, TEE, so taxed when you put in, but you're exempt as during the growth, and you're exempt when you take out. So there are advantages to the product. So we don't really know is the truth.
The only other thing I'd comment on that is that obviously as time goes on, the people who were withdrawing earlier can only have amassed a smaller deposit because of the limits on annual savings. So I don't know, I'm purely speculating, but whether if you're taking out a slightly smaller amount, whether it was less significant in your purchase and maybe you're continuing to save. I'm purely speculating, but I think it's a slightly different profile because people who are spending a lot longer to build up bigger deposits as the product has been open for longer and then withdrawing that out, it might just be a slightly different profile of person.
I just think it's particularly interesting given the fact that you would expect people, if it's a habitual encouraging, if the idea is to create a habit and people have bought this first home, you'd expect to see an uptick even if there was a couple of years gap when people bought their new home rather than a really stark decline. So we did hear evidence as well about it being a good savings product potentially for basic rate taxpayers who are self-employed. Why do you think there's an age 60 cap on when people can withdraw it? What's that got to do? It feels like it's plucked out of the air and it seems a bit odd because it's not in line with anything else. What's your analysis, Ms Webster, obviously because you've been working on this sort of thing for a while, on the reasons?
So I think it's obviously important for this sort of product. If the aim is for later life savings, it's really important that you can't access it until later life. When that starts is a bit of a debate point, and obviously we've got different points in the system with the normal minimum pension age for your private pension savings. As you know, it's currently 55. That will go up to 57 in 2028, and then the state pension age is obviously continuing to rise as well. So I think it's about making sure that you've got this window for people to open the product before they're 40, contribute to the product until they're 50, and then waiting 10 years. I think that was part of the original Michael Johnson design there. Mr. Glenn will correct me if I'm wrong on that. I think it is about making sure we've got kind of sensible cut-offs in the system. I agree. It's a different one than ones we have elsewhere.
In a way, I mean, we better to ask Michael Johnson about this or a member of the previous government. But to be fair to them, it's a midway point between when you're able to take your pension early and when you take your pension. If you see what I mean. So
I think it was potentially a compensation from the last government for changes to the state pension age.
No, because you can still take your pension. You can still take some of your pension early. Don't forget, 10 years before you retire. So this, at 60, is a midway point between that and when you do retire.
Okay. And I suppose my final question on this is, I think with the £500 million that's going into this product, we've heard evidence that as a retirement savings product there is a desperate need. 1 in 5 people who are self-employed are not are saving for retirement. Is this the best this government can do, Minister, do you think? Looking at the evidence that you've heard today, I think we're all forming an opinion, and the evidence that we heard, do you think it's the best we can do to serve self-employed people? And
it's not the only product out there for self-employed. So I think if this was the only thing the government or the previous government were doing to help the self-employed, it wouldn't be enough. I think there is a question as to what we do to help the self-employed save for a pension, because it's not as easy, is it? The whole point of auto-enrolment is inertia, but you can't get that if you're self-employed. So it is one product of a number of products that you could use if you're self-employed, if you want to develop, if you want to save into a pension. But I think overall, the government, I mean, I spoke at an event when I was the pensions minister, I think it was earlier this year or late last year, that the IFS brought together, because they did a study into the low level of pension savings of the self-employed. I think this is a problem that has got worse over time as well. The graph seems to go like that. There used to be, whether that's because more and more people are self-employed, but in the current workplace because of different ways of being employed and different types of jobs that we didn't have before. I don't know. I'm not an expert in the labour force analysis, but this isn't the only thing we're doing. But I think it is. I think the lack of pension savings of the self-employed is of concern. Not my job anymore, unfortunately. I mean, I'm very pleased to be in this job, but something that you might want to ask the pensions minister.
Thank you.
So just in summary then, who do you think this product is for as a pension, as a retirement savings product?
Well, I mean, it is a flexible product. I mean, it could be for the self-employed, but it could be for employees who have an employer that's perhaps not matching the amount they're putting in. I mean, Ms. Webster.
Yeah, I think it's that point on where do you want to make your additional voluntary contributions, and obviously it's not for us to give advice, but where there's an employer contribution, you would hope people are taking advantage of that, and then different schemes will have different options, whether you can continue to contribute personally on top of that or whether you want to open a lifetime ISA, but definitely something that people should look at the options and decide what's right for them.
Of course, if someone's offering it, they may only be able to give advice on the product they're offering, not necessarily advice around the whole pensions arena. Is that a worry that means that it's only going to be, so people will be self-selecting, getting advice on the product, but they won't get advice in the round about pension savings?
They'll only get advice if they pay for it, and they get targeted support if they don't pay. Or at the moment they don't get anything really.
I mean, the point is, if one of us wants to take out a lifetime ISA thinking that was because the lower rate taxpayer, basic rate taxpayer, might be a sensible thing to do, you go to the supplier, the provider, they provide advice on that product, but they can't provide advice on your overall situation unless you're paying for it, which lots of people, as we know, aren't. So is that a concern?
It's a concern about all financial products, but that's what we're trying to, this whole problem of that big gap is something that we're trying to solve through the advice guidance boundary review. Yeah.
Can I just come in on that who's this for thing? So obviously we know the intention when it was set up, but currently if you've got £5,000 spare that you want to save for later life and you're happy to put it in till 60 and you eyes open about the penalty charge, is this the best way to get, is this the best return you can get for that £5,000?
We're not here to give financial advice to people. So, I mean, it will depend very much on your circumstance. It will depend on your lifetime allowance. It will depend on your allowance. It will depend on what your employer does in terms of their contributions. It will depend whether you prefer to pay tax up front and be exempt, so the TEE, which is, I think, what Michael Johnson had in mind. Whereas,
Yeah, I mean, in effect, though, for basic rate taxpayers, the bonus really gave the effect of exemption on entry because it was effectively EEE. Really.
Yes, yeah. I think so. I think the original intention for the basic rate taxpayer was EEE, but obviously you've got to assess that in the round on anything else that you're doing with your money. So, I mean, we just have to be careful here. I mean, providers have to be careful to give advice, but I don't want to be quoted from this committee by saying if you have this amount of money, you should do this with your money. It completely depends on the circumstances of the individual.
Thank you. John Grady MP.
Yeah, just on the other side of this, of course, are the providers, and the evidence we've had is none of the major banks and a lot of the big ISA providers don't provide leases. Neither actually do some of the big building societies. So it's a pretty small pool of providers that provide this product. Why do you think that is? Is it because they're concerned about the risk of mis-selling, in particular for a long-term retirement product? And has the Treasury done any work to understand why lease is not very popular with the investment providers? Maybe a question for Ms. Webster.
I mean, obviously it's a commercial decision of the providers whether they want to offer the product, and a lot of work was done with the FCA on guidance to make sure providers were appropriately supported and on the kind of any concerns about risk of mis-selling or consumer duty, and there was additional guidance through FCA supplied. So there hasn't been any kind of push beyond that, making sure people understand the product and know how to engage with it if they choose to do so. I mean, obviously there's lots of conversations with providers and the wider industry, which we and the Minister will speak to frequently, but not in terms of kind of us pushing providers to try and offer something that they're not currently offering.
I mean, maybe a follow-up question for the Minister. I mean, this is quite an important point because I think about 6% of eligible people have opened up a LISA. And it is really, really important that people save more for their retirements. That's what the data shows. You've got a real problem coming down the train tracks. It's really important we get fresh capital into British industry and British businesses. And all this points to a situation where we need people to save more. And here we have a saving product that very few people use, and very few of the main providers are actually prepared to provide. So understanding why that is the case would appear to be pretty important to me. Would you agree, Minister?
I think we should dig into it more, but what I will say is that it's one savings product, right? So, I mean, there are lots of people between the ages of 18 and 39 who have access to different savings products. It's one of a suite of savings products. So you wouldn't expect the take-up to be a huge percentage. I agree with you, 6% is really not very high, but 9%, that's 1 in 10 first-time buyers since its inception in 2017, given it will have had a quite slow start. That's not bad, actually. So, you know, it's sort of mixed, I'd say.
And I get just to add, I think the fact that we're now 88% of employees are saving into a workplace pension. So the fact that if 6% and not all of those 6 might be motivated by later life savings, and it's like apples and pears, but there are a big chunk of people who are now saving into workplace pensions thanks to automatic enrolment. And then the research published yesterday does include some views from eligible non-holders, precisely to try and understand a little bit better why people who could open a lifetime ISA don't choose to do so, and that when the quantitative work follows, I think will answer some of the earlier questions about is there something in the demographic profile about people who are eligible but not taking it up. Maybe to your earlier point around are lower income individuals or lower income households like appearing more risk averse and choosing not to take up a lifetime ISA. So it would be very useful to have the findings of that study.
Do you think, Dame Meg?
Rachel Blake, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to the research that's coming up because I think we're all very excited about it. When is it going to be published?
So it's nearly finished, as I understand it. So HMRC, the waves of the survey, the Minister said earlier, the second phase was conducted towards the end of 2024. So that work is being kind of written up by the contractor and kind of quality assured as you would expect. And then the survey with the eligible non-holders, I believe, started in February. So that should end.
Number 3.
Yes.
And number 2 is due to finish any time?
Yes. So
weeks, months?
I mean, I would expect the general rule for government social research is that once the department has a signed off report, it aims to publish that within 12 weeks. So it could be weeks to a few months, I would expect.
Weeks to months.
Yes.
A new one. And the third report, which is the people who don't have it, is about a few months behind that.
So I'm expecting we can confirm to the committee if this is wrong, but I'm expecting it to be the same report. So there are 3 phases, but
okay.
the final report will include both quantitative surveys.
Okay, and just to understand to recap on the context to make sure that we're really clear, it will help us understand what I see as the distributional problem, what myself and Dr. Sander have talked about in terms of which part of the income distribution this is helping. So it does cover that.
Yes.
And it addresses the dead weight problem by asking where the money's coming from.
Yes.
And are there any other ways in which the research can address the dead weight problem?
So that question that individuals are asked whether it was essential to facilitate the purchase of their house.
But it's a self-reporting.
Yes.
But it's 1,500 people self-reporting.
Yeah. It is a weighted and representative sample, though, so the results should be robust and valid. And the other thing to note, it's not just the individual's income, but we'll also look at the household income, which is normally something that's quite challenging with HMRC data, because obviously it's individual level data sets, so the research will help us understand better about the household position.
Does it break people down by their current tenure, so living with parents, private renter?
I would need to check that.
Okay. Yeah. And then, sorry, Minister, you did give us one. You gave us a hypothetical. I've been resisting asking you hypothetical questions, but you engaged in the hypothetical by talking about lifting the cap. So hypothetically, if we were to find that there was a significant dead weight problem here, what types of changes might be available to this product or to a home ownership product?
That's a lot of hypothetical.
That is a lot of hypothetical.
I think we want to be led by the evidence here. We need to look at the evidence. I think that there is significant social benefit in ensuring that we have more first-time buyers. It's something that the government is prioritising. There's different ways you can do that, as I've suggested, and I think the planning reforms is a big part of that. So increasing the supply of homes is obviously a huge priority for this government. So I personally wouldn't call it a dead weight, because, it's still that generation are still having to pay much higher prices, and the ratio between their earnings and the house prices is much, much higher than it was 10, 20 years ago, let alone 30, 40 years ago. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful about how we think about home ownership and who this scheme is helping.
Just on the research that's coming up, it's obviously plays into the work we're doing, and I wondered if it's possible if we could have sight of that in confidence in order to help craft our report for the secondary research from HMRC.
We can speak to HMRC.
If it's imminently going to be published to the department, we would obviously maintain our confidence on that.
And let me check on the completion of the fieldwork for the final.
Yeah, it would be just if we can have some dialogue about that behind the scenes, just because it would be odd for us to put out a report that didn't reflect that. We would make sure we would time it appropriately. So that we could negotiate that. And just finally for me, before I pass to Ms Yang on another slightly different issue, I don't know if it's fair to say, Minister, in some ways you seem maybe ambivalent about this product. Do you like the lifetime ISA?
It's not whether I like it, it's whether...
Look, we looked at it because it's an interesting product.
Government is about trade-offs, and I think it is healthy to look at it in the round of the broader ISA framework, but also to see what the advantages of it are and the disadvantages. And I do think there are advantages to it, and I do think there are disadvantages, and some of them, those have been brought out, and some of them have been brought out in your evidence sessions. So I'm relatively open-minded at this stage.
Everything's on the table. I think it's just worth saying this because people might be watching it and worried that there might be changes if they've got a lifetime ISA now. Can you just say for the record that if a product were to be abolished, for example, just to take the extreme end of the options, that existing holders of ISAs would be protected under the regime? Just that there would be the legacy product would continue.
I mean, that is what's happened in previous cases.
Exactly.
So if you look at the Help to Buy ISA, and by the way,
that
will have had an impact on the figures in the early lifetime of this product, because the Help to Buy ISA you were still able to subscribe.
I just wonder if you can say anything reassuring to people on the record about
that. That we know that there are over 1 million people invested in this. There are £5.5 billion invested in it. We we want to provide reassurance to those people that we want to encourage them to keep saving, and we see this as a product that's helping them to do that, but we are looking at the reform of the ISA landscape more broadly.
Thank you. People will take that as they do. Last but not least, of course, Yuan Yang.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Webster, I have a question more about the structure of assessment of tax release versus spending lines. The lifetime ISA coming up has just had its 8th birthday. And we've just heard about the great research that HMRC is doing that we'll hear from in due course. If this had been structured not as a tax relief or as a tax benefit, but as a spending line, for example, if it had been a Ministry of Housing spending line to promote home ownership, let's say, would it have received a higher level of scrutiny over those 8 years?
I don't think it would have been a different level of scrutiny. I think it's more the kind of framework through which it's scrutinised. But I don't think it's true that it would have been a different level of scrutiny, because all the lines, whether they're tax or spend, the Treasury has a close eye on.
Does that mean that for the million or so people who hold who hold lifetime ISAs, that there would be ongoing collection of data on their use, and if so, whose departmental responsibility is that?
I'm sure you're aware that the Treasury and HMRC work in policy partnership together. So the kind of analytical resource in HMRC is very much part of that partnership. So it's not the case that Treasury kind of has their own analysts working on tax research, for example. We do that very much in partnership with HMRC. So I would say it is a policy partnership responsibility. And as I'd expect with any research of this nature, you kind of receive the report, and then part of that part of receiving it is deciding whether and when to do any follow-up work. In some cases, the research throws up things you might not have expected, or a survey has to be contained to some extent, so there might have been questions that were not included in this round, but if there were kind of sufficient interest and ministers wanted further work, then there's always options to kind of design a future programme of research, and whether that is lifetime ISA or other products, HMRC have a kind of a very ongoing active research programme.
Has that data been collected over time with the intention of assessment and analysis of the benefit, or is it collected just as a byproduct of HMRC's tax returns?
So HMRC thankfully is a very data-rich organisation, and that facilitates lots of really helpful analysis, and that's the basis of much of the modelling that goes into the OBR when we originally cost policies. That data is not perfect, because no data is perfect, and I think a particular challenge for HMRC data is that it is, because we have an individual-based tax system, it isn't possible to properly link couples or families living together. So that is where kind of additional research is often most valuable to get a broader picture of the taxpayer. Obviously, government has to decide the burden of data collection, and it has to be appropriate for both from a kind of individual citizen perspective, but also the burdens placed on providers, if it's providers who have to supply the data to HMRC, and HMRC to kind of cleanse and manage that data. So there's a constant kind of balance to be struck. But I think we are quite lucky that HMRC is a pretty data-rich organisation. You will have seen from the questions that the committee have sent to HMRC already, there are a few things that HMRC are not, either do not have, or to extract would take quite a significant amount of time.
It just strikes me that the collection of data and the design of the data collection has not necessarily been done with impact assessment in mind, and that's the case for not just this particular tax credit, but for over 1,000 tax reliefs that remain in the Treasury and HMRC's hands. And so I just wanted to register that concern.
Yeah, okay. No, sorry, I get the question. So I think part of it is, for example, if there's in our self-assessment data, the kind of mechanics and process of adding new fields to that is a decision that is regularly reviewed, and we will think about what data we need to collect and whether there's improvements to be made. That is obviously a kind of prioritisation exercise and question of trade-offs. I think that's all I'll say on that.
Of course, HMRC is limited. It can really, it's only supposed to be collecting the data that's important for collecting tax.
Yes.
So there is a limit to the data sets that they can. So I mean, this is the beginning of another conversation, I think. So rather than start this at the end of the session, can I thank the Minister, Emma Reynolds MP, Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and Laura Webster, Director of Personal Tax, Welfare and Pensions at the Treasury, for their time today. The transcript of the session will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and we will be producing our report in due course, possibly in depending exactly on the timing of that HMRC research. So can I thank you very much indeed. Order.